I arrived at my daughter's house without calling first, on the morning of her son's birthday, and I found my grandson locked in the detached garage wearing nothing but a diaper and a thin onesie, the space heater beside him unplugged and cold. Through the kitchen window 20 feet away, I could see balloons, a cake with 8 candles waiting to be lit, and my daughter laughing with her in-laws over mimosas. I put my shoulder through that garage's side door until the frame splintered, scooped my grandson's limp little body into my coat, and walked into that birthday party without knocking. Then I looked my daughter dead in the eye and said 7 words that emptied the blood from her face. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from down in the comments, friend. And if you believe a grandfather's first job is to protect, not to stay quiet, hit that like button and subscribe, because this family is about to learn exactly what that means. My name is Harold Whitfield. I'm 61 years old, spent 34 years as a commercial airline pilot before I retired. And if there's one thing 3 decades in a cockpit teaches a man, it's this. You trust your instruments over your gut feeling, but when both of them are screaming the same warning, you don't wait around to find out if you're wrong. That morning, both of them were screaming. It started at 7:15 a.m. with a call from my bank's fraud department. $22,000 had been withdrawn from the trust I'd set up for my grandson, Mason, the day he was born. Mason has a congenital heart defect, a narrow aortic valve that requires quarterly cardiology visits and a medication regimen that isn't cheap, but it's not optional either. Miss it, and his heart works twice as hard as it should. I built that trust so my daughter Renee and her husband Derek would never have to choose between rent and Mason's heart medicine. The withdrawal memo read, "Emergency cardiac specialist consultation on Mason's 8th birthday, a Saturday." I called Renee. Straight to voicemail. I called Derek. Same thing. I sat there at my kitchen table with my coffee going cold, running the numbers the way I used to run pre-flight checklists, and none of it added up. No cardiology office does emergency consultations on a Saturday morning for a scheduled birthday party. I'd had a bad feeling about Derek for months, if I'm honest with you. Back in July, he'd come to me asking for a $30,000 loan, said their basement had flooded and the foundation needed shoring up before it got worse. I drove the 2 hours to their place myself, climbed down into that basement with a flashlight, and found it bone dry. Not a water stain anywhere. I told him no, and told him why. He didn't speak to me for 6 weeks after that. Something in me had been quietly bracing ever since. The way you brace when a warning light flickers off too fast to trust that it's really fixed. I got in my truck and drove the 90 minutes to their place outside Harrisburg, the whole way replaying every clipped phone call, every excuse Renee had made for why Mason wasn't feeling up to visitors the last few months. I parked down the block, the way you learn to when your gut tells you the front door isn't going to give you the truth. I came around through the side yard toward the detached garage, planning to knock and ask Derek straight to his face where that money went. That's when I heard it. A thin, wheezing whimper coming from inside the garage. I looked through the small side window, and my whole chest went cold in a way 34 years of turbulence never managed. Mason was sitting on the concrete floor in the corner, knees pulled to his chest, wearing only a diaper, a boy of 8, in a diaper, God knows why, in a thin cotton onesie that didn't even reach his ankles. It was 34 degrees that morning. The space heater beside him sat dark and silent, its cord coiled uselessly next to an outlet 6 feet away. His lips had that same terrible blue-gray color I remember warning lights making on an instrument panel right before something fails completely. His small chest was heaving in short, shallow pulls, like he couldn't get a full breath down. I didn't knock. I didn't think. I grabbed a cinder block sitting by the flower bed and put it through the small window, reached in, and unlatched the door from the inside. I was on my knees next to him in 2 seconds, pulling off my coat and wrapping him in it, and when I picked him up, his little body felt wrong. Too light, too still, his skin like something left in a freezer. He tried to say "Grandpa" and couldn't get the word past his chattering teeth. Through the kitchen window of that house, I could see the whole party glowing warm and gold. A cake. Balloons that said "Happy 8th birthday Mason" in gold script. Renee laughing with her head thrown back. Derek's parents, Jean and Carol, holding up mimosa flutes for a toast. Nobody so much as glanced toward the garage. I carried my grandson to the kitchen door, and it was locked, so I didn't spend one more second deciding what kind of man I was going to be. I backed up, put my shoulder into the door frame, and drove through it on the second try, the wood splintering around the lock. The sound stopped every conversation in that kitchen cold. Renee's mimosa glass shattered on the tile. Carol screamed and grabbed the edge of the counter. Derek spun around, gravy fork still in his hand, his face draining white as printer paper. I stood there in that doorway with my frozen grandson wrapped in my coat, and I looked at my daughter, and I said the 7 words I'd been holding since I saw him through that window. You left him outside to die, Renee. The room went so quiet I could hear the space heater's cold silence from clear across the yard. Dad, what are you doing? You broke our door, Derek started, and I watched him try to find his footing, try to find outrage to hide behind. Why was my grandson locked in a cold garage in a diaper, Derek? I asked. I kept my voice level, flat. The way you talk to a co-pilot when the engine's failing and panic will only get people killed. Renee found her voice first, and it came out defensive, brittle. He wet himself during the gift opening, and he was being disruptive, crying, ruining Mason's little brother's turn to open presents. We just needed him to calm down for 10 minutes. That's all. 10 minutes. 10 minutes. I want you to sit with that for a second, friend, because I had to. Mason's lips were blue. His skin was ice. That boy had been out there far longer than 10 minutes, forgotten, while his own mother refilled her champagne glass. Gene, Derek's father, cleared his throat and puffed himself up like a man used to being obeyed. Now hold on, Harold. This is a family matter. You don't just break down a man's door over a little discipline. I didn't answer him. I tightened my hold on Mason, whose small hand had found the collar of my shirt and gripped it like he was afraid I'd disappear too. I looked at each of them once, slow, memorizing their faces the way you memorize a runway before a landing you know is going to be rough. Then I said the last thing I had to say to that room. The account is frozen, all of it, effective this morning. And I turned and walked out through the broken door with my grandson in my arms, into the cold, toward my truck. Derek came sprinting out after me across the frost-covered lawn in his socks, screaming that I couldn't take him, that this was kidnapping, that he was calling the police right that second. I ignored him completely. I set Mason gently in the passenger seat, cranked the heat to full blast, and got us moving before Derek even finished dialing. My hands were steady on the wheel. 34 years of flying teaches you that steady hands and a racing mind can occupy the same body. But inside, I was running through everything at once. Mason had stopped shivering somewhere around the 2nd mile, and that scared me more than anything else that morning. A body that's still fighting the cold shivers. A body giving up stops. I kept one hand against his chest, feeling for the rise and fall, counting his breaths against the dashboard clock the way I used to count altitude against airspeed on final approach. Shallow, ragged. There was a faint, wet whistle underneath every inhale that had nothing to do with the cold and everything to do with a heart valve that needed medicine he apparently hadn't been getting. Mercy General was 11 minutes out. I drove that route like I was threading a storm cell, and I did not once look at the speedometer. I carried him through the ER's sliding doors, and the second the triage nurse saw his color, she hit the emergency button under her desk without asking a single question. A crash team had him on a gurney and behind double doors before I'd even finished saying his name. I stood in that lobby with my coat still damp from the frost, my hands empty for the first time in an hour, and I waited. 12 minutes later, a doctor came through those doors, stripping off her gloves, her expression pulled tight with something between clinical focus and barely restrained fury. "Are you his grandfather?" she asked. "Harold Whitfield," I said. "Yes, I'm Dr. Priya Anand," she said. "We're stabilizing his core temperature, but I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. Does this child have a cardiac condition?" "Congenital valve defect," I said. "He's on a beta blocker and a diuretic, has been since he was 2. Quarterly follow-ups with a pediatric cardiologist." She nodded slowly, like a piece was sliding into place she didn't want confirmed. "We ran blood work the moment he came in. Mr. Whitfield, there is no trace of either of those medications in his system. None. A child on a maintenance regimen like that should show consistent levels. His levels are 0, which tells me he hasn't been dosed in weeks, possibly longer. Combined with the hypothermic exposure this morning, his heart has been under considerably more strain than it should ever have to bear." I felt something in my chest go very cold and very still, colder than the morning air outside. I pulled out my phone, opened my banking app, and turned the screen toward her. This morning, $22,000 was withdrawn from the medical trust I set up for him. The withdrawal note says it was for an emergency cardiac consultation. "Doctor," Anand looked at the screen, then back at me. and something in her clinical composure cracked just slightly. "Whatever that money paid for," she said quietly, "it was not his medication." She told me, as a mandated reporter, she already had an obligation to document everything, the hypothermia, the absent medication, all of it, and she'd have the full report ready. I sat down in a plastic chair in that waiting room, the adrenaline slowly draining out of me and leaving something harder behind, and I started doing what I do best, running the checklist, finding the failure point before it takes the whole plane down. I hadn't been sitting there 5 minutes when the sliding doors hissed open and two police officers walked in, scanning the room with the particular alertness of men looking for a specific face. They found mine fast. I was the only person sitting alone with muddy boots and a torn shirt sleeve. "Harold Whitfield?" the taller one asked, and I recognized the tone immediately. It was an arrest tone. "That's me," I said, and I didn't stand, didn't raise my hands, just kept my palms flat on my knees. "We received a call from a Derek Larson reporting a home invasion and the abduction of his son. You're the primary suspect in a kidnapping. I need you to stand up slowly." I stood, slow and steady, and asked permission before reaching into my coat pocket, then handed over my phone with the bank alert and the time-stamped photo I'd taken through that garage window before I broke it. Mason huddled blue-lipped on cold concrete, the birthday party glowing gold in the window behind him. The younger officer's jaw tightened as he looked at it. The older one, whose badge read Delgado, went very quiet. "That timestamp's from 40 minutes before your call came in," Delgado said slowly, more to his partner than to me. "I didn't drive here to kidnap my grandson," I told him. "I drove here because a $22,000 withdrawal from his medical trust didn't make sense on a Saturday morning. I found him locked in an unheated garage. I brought him straight to the nearest emergency room instead of driving away. Ask yourself what a kidnapper does with a stolen child, officer, and then ask yourself if that's what you're looking at." Delgado was still holding my phone when Dr. Anand came striding back through those double doors, her expression thunderous, a stack of lab printouts in her fist. "Are you the officers handling the Larson case?" she demanded. And before either of them could answer, she was already laying it out. The absent medication, the hypothermic exposure, the fact that if I hadn't brought him in when I did, his heart might not have tolerated the strain much longer. Delgado keyed his radio without another word to me. "Dispatch, cancel that. Suspect is cooperative, situation's reversed. I need a unit to the Larson residence to secure the parents. We're opening a child endangerment investigation." That's when the doors hissed open again, and Derek came storming in with Renee behind him, both of them still in their party clothes, and trailing them like a bodyguard in an expensive golf jacket was Gene, Derek's father, moving with the particular swagger of a man who's never once been told no and meant it. Derek pointed straight at me. "That's him. That's the man who broke into my house and took my son. Arrest him right now." Delgado didn't so much as blink. "Sir, I'd lower your voice. You're in a pediatric emergency department." Gene shouldered past his son toward the reception desk, pulled a leather billfold from his jacket, and I watched him lean in toward the charge nurse with the oily, practiced smile of a man who's bought his way out of trouble before. "Listen," he said, low enough he thought no one else could hear. "I understand family misunderstandings happen. I'm prepared to make a very generous donation to this hospital's pediatric wing, $50,000. Maybe more if we can just quietly lose some paperwork tonight and get my grandson released to his mother." I had my phone's recorder running before he finished the sentence. The charge nurse's expression didn't change, but her eyes flicked toward Delgado, who had gone very still. Before Gene could dig himself any deeper, the double doors swung open again, and Dr. Anand reappeared alongside a woman I hadn't seen before, sharp-suited, carrying a state ID on a lanyard and a clipboard thick with forms. "I'm Agent Reyes with Child Protective Services," she said, her voice carrying no warmth at all. "Mr. Larson, Miss Whitfield Larson, effective immediately, you are both barred from coming within 500 feet of your son. The state is assuming emergency custody. He'll remain in the temporary care of his grandfather, Harold Whitfield, who is the only adult in this situation who acted to protect this child today." Renee let out a sound I'd never heard her make before, somewhere between a sob and a scream, reaching toward her father like Gene's money could fix this the way it seemed to fix everything else in that family. Gene didn't reach back. I watched something in his face shut like a door. I picked my grandson up from where a nurse had wrapped him warm on a gurney, felt his small fingers curl into my shirt collar, and I walked out of that hospital lobby without another word to any of them. But I want you to understand something, friend, because I certainly understood it in that parking lot with the cold air biting at my face and my grandson finally warm against my chest. This wasn't over. Not even close. A missing $22,000 doesn't just vanish into nothing. And a man who lets his own son go blue-lipped in a garage to protect a birthday party doesn't do that on instinct alone. Something had been rotting under that family for a long time, and I intended to find every last inch of it. The silence in my study that night was the kind you only get after a long, hard flight, once the wheels are finally down and the adrenaline hasn't caught up to the fact that it's over yet. Mason was asleep upstairs in my guest room, wrapped in 3 blankets with a humidifier humming on the dresser, his breathing still faintly wheezy but steadying by the hour. I sat behind my desk and dialed a number I hadn't used in almost 2 years. Priya Okafor picked up on the second ring. She's a forensic accountant, sharp as any instrument panel I ever flew behind, and 20 years ago, she was a young single mother working the night shift at the regional airport where I was based, trying to put herself through accounting school between flights. I noticed the way her mind worked with numbers, fast, clean, merciless, and I quietly covered her tuition for her final 2 years. She never forgot it, and neither did I. "Harold," she said, "you don't call on a Saturday night unless something's on fire." "Something's on fire," I told her. "I need every account with my name on it locked down tonight, and I need you to trace a $22,000 withdrawal from a restricted medical trust." She didn't ask why. She started typing before I finished the sentence. Within a minute, she had the trust activity pulled up, and I heard her breath catch. "Harold, this wasn't just today," she said slowly. "There's a pattern here. Smaller withdrawals going back 4 months, $200-300 at a time, always logged as medical copay or prescription refill. Someone's been slow bleeding this account for months before today's big one." I felt my jaw tighten. Where did today's $22,000 actually go? More typing. A long pause. "It went to a private aviation charter company," she said finally. "A deposit on a leased Cessna. Harold Derrick's been quietly working toward a private pilot's license. There's a flight school in the metadata too. Lessons, going back 5 months." I sat there in my study feeling something colder than that garage floor settle into my chest. My son-in-law had been draining his own child's heart medication fund to buy himself flying lessons. The son of a man who'd spent 34 years in a cockpit, stealing from a boy's failing heart to chase the one thing that had always made me proud of my own life. There was almost something obscene in the specificity of it. "Keep digging," I told her. "If he siphoned a trust this carelessly, he's bled something bigger somewhere. Find it." 2 days later, she called back, and this time there was no hesitation in her voice at all, just the flat, dangerous calm of someone who'd found exactly what she was looking for. "Harold, I pulled the county property records on your house. There's a lien filed against it. A home equity line of credit opened 11 weeks ago for $180,000. I went very still. "That's not possible. That deed has never had another name on it." "It does now," she said. "There's a durable power of attorney on file, notarized, granting Derrick Larson authority over your financial and real estate holdings. Harold, the signature on it is yours." I thought back immediately to that July afternoon, the flooded basement that wasn't flooded, the 2 hours I'd spent down there with a flashlight while Derrick waited upstairs. I now understood, in my study at my own desk, with my old flight logs and canceled checks, and every sample of my handwriting he could possibly need. "He forged it," I said quietly, while I was in his basement looking for a leak that never existed. "There's more," Priya said, and her voice dropped lower. "The HELOC funds were wired out 3 days after closing, not to a bank account, to an escrow account tied to a hangar lease at Meridian Regional Airfield. He's not just taking flying lessons, Harold. He's leasing a hangar. He's building toward owning a plane." I sat with that for a long moment, staring at the dark window, the whole shape of it clicking into place with the sick clarity of a mechanical failure you should have caught on inspection. He hadn't just stolen from his son's heart medication. He'd forged my identity to mortgage the roof over my head, all to fund a fantasy of being the man I actually was. And he'd planned, I now understood with total certainty, to default on that loan and let the debt collapse onto my shoulders, bankrupting me in the process, while he sat in some rented hangar pretending at a life he hadn't earned. "I want to alert the bank and freeze it immediately," Priya said. "This is straightforward fraud, Harold. We go now." "No," I said. "Not yet. Harold, if we move now, he lawyers up and claims confusion, claims I gave him verbal authorization, drags it out for years while my name gets dragged through court alongside his. I want him standing in that courtroom certain he's already won before I show him exactly how much he's already lost. Keep documenting everything, quietly. We move when he's got no room left to run. 3 days later, the custody hearing was set, and Derek and Renee walked into that courtroom dressed like they were auditioning for sympathy. Derek in a gray suit, hair combed flat, Renee in a modest cardigan with red-rimmed eyes that looked suspiciously well-timed. Their attorney, a slick young man named Prescott, stood and painted a portrait of a devoted young family torn apart by an unstable, aggressive grandfather who'd broken into their home in an unprovoked rage and abducted their child during a birthday celebration. Derek testified, voice trembling on cue, that Mason had simply been having a tantrum and they'd let him cool down for a few minutes in the garage, that his heart condition had actually improved dramatically and he barely needed medication anymore, that I had a documented history invented on the spot, apparently of erratic behavior since my wife passed 3 years ago. I sat beside Priya at our table and let every word of it wash over me without so much as a flinch, because I'd learned a long time ago that you let the storm build exactly as high as it wants to before you show it the mountain it's about to hit. When Prescott finished, our attorney, a tightly composed woman named Marlene Cho, whom Priya had brought in, rose without a trace of theater. She laid the hospital toxicology report on the judge's bench first, zero trace of Mason's heart medication in his bloodstream for weeks. Then the time-stamped photograph of Mason blue-lipped on that garage floor. Then the audio recording of Jean attempting to bribe the charge nurse, which made Jean, sitting rigid in the gallery, visibly shrink into his expensive coat. And finally, she laid down the forged power of attorney, the HELOC paperwork, and the hangar lease documents side by side. Your Honor, Marlene said, opposing counsel would have this court believe my client is an unstable man prone to erratic outbursts. I'd ask the court to explain then how an unstable man managed to forge a flawless legal signature, notarize a fraudulent power of attorney, secure a $180,000 loan against a home he never agreed to mortgage, and route the proceeds into a private aviation lease, all while his son lay hypothermic in a garage he'd been financing with the boy's own heart medication. The judge, a stern woman named Judge Okonkwo, went very quiet reading through the documents. Prescott, to his credit, looked at his own clients with something close to horror, and by the time the hearing ended, he'd withdrawn as their counsel entirely, citing that he'd been deliberately misled regarding material facts. Judge Okonkwo revoked Renee and Derek's custody rights on the spot, granted me full permanent guardianship of Mason, and referred the entire financial fraud case to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. Derek, I later learned, took a plea deal 7 years for identity theft, forgery, and bank fraud, with an additional consecutive sentence for child endangerment. Renee received probation and mandatory counseling, having genuinely, it seems, not known the full extent of what Derek had done, though the court made clear that ignorance of her son freezing on a concrete floor was not a defense anyone accepted. Jean's real estate dealings, once the FBI started looking, turned up their own tangle of trouble, entirely unrelated to us, and I understand his business partners quietly cut him loose within the year. It's been 8 months now. Spring came late this year, but it came. I'm sitting on my back porch as I tell you this, watching Mason chase our new dog, a scrappy little beagle mix he named Co-Pilot, across a yard gone green again. His color's good. His breathing's clear and even, no more of that wet whistle underneath it, because he gets his medication every single morning without fail, and I've never once had to wonder whether the person giving it to him actually loves him or is just counting the cost of it. He's gained 8 pounds. He laughs loud enough to carry across the whole yard now, the kind of laugh a kid only has in him when he's stopped being afraid of what happens next. Some nights he still wakes up asking if the garage door is locked, and I sit with him until he falls back asleep, and I tell him the truth every time. Nobody is ever locking that boy outside again as long as I'm breathing. I've learned something in all this that I think about more than I expected to. At 61 years old, sitting on a porch, I nearly lost to a man who called himself my son-in-law. Family was never supposed to be a checklist you complete out of obligation. It's not blood, and it's certainly not a birthday party glowing warm in a window while a child freezes 20 feet away. It's who shows up when the cold sets in. It's who breaks the door down. If you've ever had to set a hard boundary to protect someone you love, even against your own family, I'd love to hear about it down in the comments, friend. And if this story moved you even a little, hit that like button, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.